So this is Unit 2, Module 3, Lesson 3, Procedures and Building Blocks. So we've talked about procedures before, but we really haven't talked much about why they're important, why you should be using them. The idea comes down to being able to reuse code. One of the major advantages of dealing with computer science is the fact that you can reuse the same code over and over again. When you create a procedure, you can use the same piece of code within your program, but then you could also use that same piece of code within other programs. So you can kind of create a library for yourself. In fact, often in other languages, we have libraries of commands, libraries of things that we're able to do that other people have done and have shared with us. So you can pull those libraries in to your program. So this process of going through your code and looking to see where you can change and create a procedure is called refactoring. So if we look at our code here, we can see that there's a spot here where we have some code, and then we have the identical code down here. So when we have our submit button for our list, we have going through this for loop here, and we're joining labels with list items and all this fun stuff. But then we have to do the exact same thing when we initialize the screen, so that way when the database first loads, it loads everything into the screen. So this piece of code, because it's in there twice, so how do you define a procedure when you have some code to refactor? So what we do is we take this section of code and we look at what data it needs and what information it has to result in. So in other words, send back. So in this particular example, it needs the list that we need to display. So I'm going to create a procedure. I'm going to click on the little blue box, and I'm going to add in a variable for it to contain, and I'm going to call it display list. So that way, when I get my list, I can actually pass that as a variable. So instead of get global list, I could use display list. So that way I'm not using a global variable. It's important, as you start creating procedures, to pay attention to something called scope. In other words, who has access to what information? If you're always doing global variables, that means every procedure has access to every piece of information that you have. You might want to limit that, so that way this becomes more universal. It works with any list rather than just the particular list that's in this program. So we could send it to any list whatsoever. Right now, it's set up to work with the global node list, but instead we could change this to work with a particular list. So we could change this and add in a variable to take as a parameter global node list. So when we define a procedure so it contains any list, we add in that variable called list just by clicking that blue square, dragging in a variable, calling it list. And instead of using the global, we're now using get list, which we can grab just by hovering our mouse over the word list. It'll give us that option to get list, and we can drag that in and put that right there. So now this little piece of code that displays a list will work with any list. So that's a useful procedure that you could use in any program whatsoever where you need to display a list. The one disadvantage is you have to set a list label up in there. You have to have a component in there called list label. I don't believe there's a way in this language to pass objects like that. You do have to actually create that object to make this work. In other languages, though, there are ways of passing entire objects, so that way you could not even worry about designing that list label to just be created for you. So, how would I define a procedure that helps to display any list in any label? Well, here we go. This is a little bit more complicated. Instead of changing the list label inside the procedure, we're going to send some information back. That's the result. So this is a different kind of procedure. This procedure takes information and then returns something back. So the value we want to return back is the information that we would want to put inside of the list label, as opposed to directly changing the list label. So if we go back to the previous one, here we can see that we're setting the list label to some set of items from the list. We're joining that together, putting that to the list label. But that is dependent upon having that object, that list label object. Maybe we created it, maybe we called something else, maybe we want to use it somewhere else in the program, but we don't want to put it as a label. We're limited in this procedure to having to use something called list label. So to make this more universal, we create something that sends back essentially just a piece of text that we could then use anywhere. We could put it inside of our label. We could put it in as a variable. We could send it out as a text message on our phone. We could do anything we want with it. So this procedure now takes a bunch of items in a list and combines those items into a text block that we could then assign to somewhere else. So when we call this procedure, we have to send it the list that we're interested in, but notice this time it has a little puzzle piece that has to be connected to something else. Every other procedure that we called doesn't have that puzzle piece. We just call the procedure and it just does its thing. Here, we call the procedure and it sends information back. It's a two-way street. It takes a piece of information, then sends that piece of information back. Now, there's a limit to what we can do here. We can send it as many different pieces of information as we want. We can send it as many different parameters as we want to, as many different variables. It can only send one thing back. It can only return one result. It only has one connector here for this. So you have to be creative sometimes in how you return the information. If you need to return a whole bunch of information, maybe you return an entire list instead of returning text. Maybe you return some type of larger thing, a larger structure that holds more data. So be aware whenever you use this, and this is pretty much universally true, it can only return one thing. It can't return multiple things. So if you need to package a bunch of pieces of information together and then return that one thing, then you can do that. But you have to set up that package to return the information in. So you couldn't decide to return 5 or 6 different strings unless they were joined together. So this was a really, really short lesson just to talk about how you go back and refine your code and refactor your procedures. This is important in terms of making your code more usable in the future. This is not required of all programs. Sometimes you write a script and you just kind of go with it and you like it how it is and it does what it needs to be done and you're done with it and that's it. It's a one-time throwaway script. But if it's something you're going to be reusing over and over again and it's something that you kind of like and you like that little snippet of code and it does something nice and you could see possible other uses, then you definitely want to go back and refactor that code so that way it includes procedures that you can then use in other places. Okay? So that is it for the lesson. There is a spot in Blackboard where you could go ahead and create this little list. It's not required. I'm going to make it optional. But if you want to submit it so that way you can kind of keep track of it, you would just go into Blackboard under Procedures and Block Building. There's the starter file for the project. This is the procedures that you can make the changes to the starter file and then just upload it there. And then, of course, there's the tutorial to walk you through it if you need that.